I spent 15 years building my father's company. When I first joined, it was on the verge of collapse. Debts, lawsuits, failed contracts, nothing was working. But I had studied business all my life, and I knew I could fix it. I gave up everything, sleep, friends, a personal life, just to keep it afloat. Now, after years of hard work, I had transformed it into a $120 million empire. I worked harder than anyone, knew every detail about every department, and made every major decision. The success of this company had my fingerprints all over it. Then, at a family dinner, everything changed. The evening started normally. The long dining table was covered with expensive dishes. Soft music played in the background, and laughter filled the air. But I knew my father too well. There was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence, a sense of finality. He tapped his glass and stood up. Silence filled the room. "I have an announcement to make," he said. His voice was steady, controlled. "After much thought, I have decided that it is time for me to step down." I froze. My heart pounded. This was it. The moment I had waited for all these years. The moment he would finally acknowledge my work. But then, he turned his head slightly, not towards me. He looked at my younger brother. "From today onward," my father continued, "he will be taking over as the new CEO." The words sliced through me. My brother's face was full of fake modesty, but I knew him well. He had done nothing. He had failed at every business he ever tried. He spent more time at luxury parties than in board meetings. He barely even understood how the company worked. And yet, here he was, being handed the empire I built. A slow ripple of applause moved through the room. Relatives and business partners clapped politely. My mother stole a glance at me, but said nothing. My brother lowered his gaze as if he were humbled by the decision, but I caught the small smirk he tried to hide. I felt my stomach twist, but I forced myself to smile. I had learned long ago that showing weakness in this family was dangerous. When the dinner ended, I went to my office at home. I locked the door, sat in the dark, and replayed every moment of my life. The sacrifices, the late nights, the fights, the pain. And now, just like that, it was all taken from me. But what they didn't know was that I was not the same person I used to be. They thought I would step aside quietly. They had no idea what I was about to do. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying my father's words, the polite applause, the way my brother sat there, pretending to be humble while knowing this had been planned long before. I wasn't just angry. I was burning inside. At 3 a.m., I sat in my home office, staring at my laptop screen. Every contract, every shareholding document, every executive agreement, I knew them all. If my father thought I would simply walk away, he was a fool. I opened my personal files, the ones I had spent years preparing. Years ago, while my father was busy making public appearances and my brother was busy wasting money, I was securing something far more valuable: control. I had fought for every single share I owned. When the company faced a financial crisis in 2015, my father had needed urgent capital. I had invested my own money, and in return, he transferred 20% of his shares to me. In 2018, we were hit with a major legal battle. To settle it quickly, my father signed over another 15% to me, and then, last year, when he needed an expansion loan, he used his own shares as collateral, shares that were still under my name. By the time I added up all my shares, one thing became very clear. I was the majority shareholder. I closed my laptop and exhaled. The weight of the situation pressed down on me. I had spent my entire life fighting for my place in this company, and now they wanted to erase me. I checked the time. 5:45 a.m. The sky outside was beginning to lighten. I stood up, walked to the mirror, and looked at myself. I wasn't the same person who had once begged for recognition. I straightened my shoulders. If my father and brother wanted a war, they were about to get one, and they had already lost. The next morning, I arrived at the company headquarters as usual. But this time, something was different. The whispers had already started. As I walked through the lobby, employees exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked away quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others gave me small, hesitant nods, unsure of where their loyalty should lie. They had heard the news. They all knew that my father had chosen my brother as the new CEO. But they didn't know what I knew. I walked to my office, my heels clicking against the marble floor. I didn't hesitate. I didn't let them see any doubt. I had spent too many years proving myself to let them see me shaken now. I stepped inside my office, shutting the door behind me. 15 minutes. That's how much time I had before my father and brother arrived, expecting to take over. I powered on my computer and pulled up the Executive Shareholders Agreement, August 15th, 2015. That was the date my father had signed the document that now gave me all the power. The contract was clear. No CEO transition could happen without the approval of the majority shareholder, and I was the majority shareholder. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around my desk. My father thought this would be an easy handover. He thought I would quietly step aside, train my brother, and disappear into the background. He had no idea what was waiting for him. At exactly 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my door. I didn't answer. The door swung open. My father walked in first, followed by my brother. They both wore the same expression, calm confidence. My father looked around the office as if it already belonged to someone else. He smiled slightly before speaking. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today," he said, his voice full of authority. I leaned back in my chair, studying them both. "Transition?" I repeated. "Interesting choice of words." My brother smirked, stepping forward. "Let's not make this difficult," he said, his voice full of fake concern. "We just need your cooperation. We want this to be a smooth process." I looked at him for a long moment, then turned to my father. "Dad," I said slowly, "I think you're mistaken about something." My father's expression darkened. He was used to me following orders. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. "Mistaken?" he repeated. His voice carried the same authority he had always used to control me. "This isn't a debate. The decision has been made." I smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know, Dad," I said, my voice calm. "But the thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." My brother scoffed. "Lisa, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to do this the easy way." I ignored him. Instead, I picked up the remote and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up, displaying a document. The Executive Shareholders Agreement. The color drained from my father's face. I turned to my brother. "Do you even know what this is?" He shifted uncomfortably. "A shareholders agreement," he guessed. I nodded. "That's right. And do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen, highlighting a key clause. "This contract was drafted when the company was being restructured. It clearly states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of the majority shareholder." I met my father's eyes. "And I hold 60% of the company's shares." A heavy silence filled the room. "That's impossible," my brother muttered. He stepped closer to the screen, scanning the document, his hands shaking. I leaned back in my chair. "Actually, it's very possible," I said smoothly. "You see, while you were busy failing at every business you touched, and Dad was busy making public appearances, I was securing my position." I turned to my father. "Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2015? You signed over 20% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment." His jaw clenched. "And in 2018, when we had that legal battle, another 15% was transferred under my name as collateral." My brother took a step back, his confidence crumbling. I continued. "That, plus my original 25%, makes me the majority shareholder. And according to this document, that means I have the final say in who becomes CEOI. Let my words sink in. My father was silent. His face hardened as he realized that he had no way out. My brother, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. This is ridiculous," he shouted. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." But my father didn't say a word, because he knew the truth. I had legally outmaneuvered them both. I stood up, walking around my desk slowly. "I'm not firing you, dear brother," I said, looking him in the eye. "I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market." He stiffened. "But you will report to me," I continued. "You will work under my leadership. Otherwise," I gestured toward the door, "you're free to leave." My brother turned to my father, desperate. But for the first time in his life, our father had no answer. No way to fix this. Because this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. My brother's face twisted in disbelief. He looked at my father again, waiting for him to fight back, to say something, to fix this. But my father remained silent. I could see the realization sinking in. He had lost. My brother's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," he hissed. I tilted my head. "Oh, but it is," I said, my voice calm. "Unless, of course, you'd like to challenge the legally binding contract in court. But that would take years. And in the meantime, the company would still be under my control." His breath came fast, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Finally, he turned on his heel and stormed out. Good riddance. I shifted my gaze to my father, who still stood there, rigid, his jaw tight with anger. "You burn this bridge," I told him quietly. "Not me." He took a slow breath, as if trying to regain control. "You think you've won?" he said. His voice was lower now, calmer. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I know I have." He gave a small nod, almost like an acceptance. Then, without another word, he walked out. I let out a slow breath, turning to face the screen again. It was done, or so I thought. By the next morning, I could already feel the undercurrent of unease within the company. The whispers had changed. Executives who had once respected me suddenly looked away when I passed. Department heads who had always been loyal seemed hesitant. I knew exactly what was happening. My father and brother were working behind the scenes. I imagined it clearly. My father sitting in a room full of board members, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I only ever wanted the best for my children," he would say, shaking his head. And my brother, he would play the victim. He would meet with key investors, painting himself as the loyal son, the rightful heir, the one who had been betrayed. They weren't going to accept defeat. They were going to turn everyone against me. But they had underestimated me, because I was ready for this. I called an emergency executive meeting that same afternoon. As I walked into the boardroom, I felt the tension. Some of them avoided my gaze. Others stared at me too closely, waiting for me to slip. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. "Let's not waste time," I said, my voice even. "I know there have been conversations behind closed doors." Silence. "I also know that some of you are wondering if my leadership is sustainable." A few people tensed, but no one spoke. I tapped my fingers against the polished table. "Let's clear that up now." The screen behind me lit up. I had prepared everything. Numbers, data, facts. I built this company. Under my leadership, profits had increased by 300%. We had expanded into 6 new markets. Every major success in the past decade had happened because of me. I turned to the CFO. "Do we have a single financial indicator that suggests this company is in trouble under my leadership?" The CFO hesitated. Then slowly, he shook his head. "No," I nodded. "Exactly." I scanned the room, my eyes locking onto every executive. "So, let's be honest about what's happening here." I let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader." I leaned forward. "They're upset because they expected me to step aside." No one moved. Then, I dropped the real bomb. "I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours. A few people stiffened. I folded my hands on the table. You were offered incentives to push for my resignation. More silence. If anyone would like to disclose those conversations now, this is your chance. A long pause. Then, finally, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. I received a call, he admitted. From your father. He hesitated, glancing around before continuing. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board. I nodded, unsurprised. And did he offer anything in return for your support? The man hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he gave a slow nod. There it was. I exhaled, standing up. My father built this company, I said. I won't discredit that. But I took it further than he ever could have, and I will not allow him to manipulate it from the outside. My voice dropped slightly, controlled, dangerous. If he wants a fight, I let my words hang in the air. He'll get one. I gathered my papers, looking each executive in the eye. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, I said, now is the time to make your move. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out of the boardroom. This wasn't just about keeping my company. This was about making sure they never tried to take it from me again. And I was about to make my next move. That night, I made my own call, not to a board member, not to an investor, but to a journalist. A journalist who had been waiting for this exact moment. I have something for you, I said, my voice steady. But you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over everything. Documents, emails, internal financial records. Every unethical decision my father had made over the years, every debt he had hidden, every questionable deal that had almost ruined the company before I stepped in and saved it. He thought his legacy made him untouchable. I was about to prove him wrong. The story broke within 24 hours. The truth behind the Harper empire, hidden debts, business cover-ups, and the CEO who saved it. The article was brutal. It exposed how my father's reckless decisions had nearly destroyed the company. It praised my leadership for turning things around. It made it clear that I was the only reason the company had survived. And just like that, the narrative changed. The board stopped doubting me. The investors stopped hesitating. And my father? He had nowhere to hide. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the story. 2 days later, my father called me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Lisa, he said. His voice was tight. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair. Do we? Silence. Then finally, a sigh. You didn't have to do that. I let out a small laugh. Neither did you. His voice dropped lower. This company was supposed to be a legacy. For the family, he added after a pause. For both of you. I felt something tighten in my chest. Some foolish part of me had once wanted that too, but not anymore. Dad, I said quietly, if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Another long silence. Then he asked, almost reluctantly, what happens now? I exhaled slowly. Now? Now I made sure they could never touch my company again. By the next morning, the fallout had begun. My father had spent decades building his reputation, a respected businessman, a visionary, a man of integrity. But now, all of it was under question. The news had spread beyond business circles. Clients, investors, board members, employees. They all knew the truth now. He had failed, and I had won. But I wasn't done yet. At exactly noon, I received an email from the board. An emergency meeting had been called. I wasn't surprised. I had been expecting this. They weren't discussing my removal. They were discussing my father's. When I walked into the boardroom, the air was heavy with tension. Most of the board members looked uncomfortable. A few looked furious. My father sat at the far end of the table, his posture stiff. He knew what was coming. I took my seat. My seat. The chairman, an older man who had been on my father's side for years, cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the reports," he said, his voice careful. "The financial records, the past decisions, the irregularities." I stayed silent. He hesitated, then continued. "There's no easy way to say this," he said, turning to my father. "But we can no longer allow you to hold decision-making power in this company." For the first time in my life, I saw shock on my father's face. "What?" A woman sitting across from me, one of the newer board members, spoke up. "We've unanimously agreed that it would be in the best interest of the company if you stepped down permanently." I watched as my father processed the words. This was it, his final defeat. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then he turned to me. I held all the power now. For years, he had controlled everything. He had decided who was worthy, who was valuable, who deserved to be in charge. Now he had nothing. He leaned back in his chair. His face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "If I refuse?" The chairman sighed. "Then the shareholders will vote for your removal. And well," he glanced at me, "we already know how that will go." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched him accept the truth. A long silence. Then my father gave a slow nod. "I'll resign," he said finally. And just like that, it was over. Later that evening, I received a message. It was from my brother. He wanted to meet. I didn't owe him anything, but I agreed. We met at a private office space, away from the company. He was already there when I arrived, pacing the room. When he saw me, he let out a sharp breath. "You're really going through with this," he muttered. I crossed my arms. "I already did." He shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. "You've ruined everything." "No," I corrected him. "I took back what was mine." He sat down, rubbing his hands together. He looked lost. "I can't believe Dad let this happen," he muttered. I tilted my head. "Let?" I repeated. "You still don't get it, do you? He didn't let anything happen. He lost, just like you did." He exhaled, shaking his head. "So what now?" I studied him. "You have two choices," I said simply. "One, you stay in the company. You work under me. You take an advisory role, but you will never have control." He tensed. "Or," I continued, "you take a buyout and walk away. You leave this company and you never come back." Silence. His hands clenched. "You're acting like you hold all the cards." I smiled. "I do." A thick silence filled the room. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "I'll take the buyout," he muttered. I nodded. I had expected that, because my brother had never been a fighter. He only knew how to take what was given to him. And now, there was nothing left to take. A few days later, the final paperwork was signed. My father was officially retired, my brother was gone, and I was finally, truly, in control. I should have felt victorious, and I did. But I also felt something else, an emptiness. For so many years, I had fought for this. I had sacrificed everything, and now that I had won, there was nothing left to fight. The empire was mine. But my family was gone, and deep down, a small part of me wondered, had it been worth it? The company felt different now. The moment my father and brother were gone, a shift spread through the building. Employees who once hesitated to acknowledge me now approached with respect. Some were relieved. Others still feared me. I didn't care. I hadn't fought this war for their approval. I had fought it for control, and I wasn't done yet. I spent the next few weeks making changes, real changes. I restructured the leadership team. I removed the executives who had sided with my father. I promoted people who had actually contributed to the company's growth. I implemented new strategies my father had always rejected. Innovative technology, international expansion, high-risk, high-reward investments. And it worked. Within just a few months, our profits skyrocketed. Within a year, we crossed $200 million. The company wasn't just surviving under my leadership. It was thriving. I had built this empire once. Now I was making sure no one could ever take it from me again. One evening I received a call. I stared at the name on the screen, my father. I debated ignoring it, but something inside me told me to answer. I picked up. "Lisa," he said. His voice was different, tired, quieter than I had ever heard it before. "I read about your latest deal," he continued. "It was a smart move." I smirked slightly. "I know." A soft chuckle. It wasn't bitter this time, just tired. Then silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally he sighed. "You proved me wrong," he admitted. I didn't respond. It wasn't an apology. It never would be. But it was the closest thing I was ever going to get. And strangely, I didn't need it anymore. I had already won. A year had passed since the war ended. I sat in my office looking out over the city skyline. Everything I had fought for was mine now. My father had disappeared from the business world. My brother had moved on to another failed venture. And me? I was exactly where I was meant to be. I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself, trying to earn my father's approval, trying to show them all that I deserved this. But now, I finally understood something. I didn't need validation. I didn't need approval. I only needed power. And I had taken it. And now, no one could ever take it from me again. A year had passed since I took control. At first, I thought victory would bring me peace. That once my father and brother were gone, I could finally breathe. But power doesn't come with peace. It comes with responsibility, with pressure, with enemies waiting for you to fail. And I couldn't fail. Not now. Not ever. I had spent years fighting to prove I was worthy. Now I was fighting to make sure no one ever questioned me again. Every morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. I was the last to leave at night. I knew my employees whispered about me, about how ruthless I had become. But I didn't care. Because I wasn't just running a company, I was building a legacy. My father's name had always been attached to this empire. But slowly, that was changing. Now, when people spoke about the company, they spoke about me. I was no longer my father's daughter, no longer my brother's competition. I was the empire. But no matter how much I grew the company, there was always a shadow lurking behind me. My father had disappeared from the industry, but he wasn't gone. He still had friends, connections, influence. And then one day, an investor pulled out of a major deal at the last moment. Then another, and another. At first I thought it was coincidence, but I wasn't stupid. I knew how these games were played. My father couldn't destroy me in the boardroom. He couldn't take my power away. So he was trying to make my position impossible to maintain. But he had forgotten something. I had learned from the best. I made a call. I met him at a private restaurant, neutral ground. When he walked in, I saw the changes immediately. He looked older. His once powerful presence had dimmed. But when he sat down across from me, I saw something familiar in his eyes. He wasn't done fighting. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "You've been busy," I said. He didn't respond, just took a sip of his drink. I sighed. "You lost. You know that, right?" A small smile. "Did I?" I tilted my head. "Is this really how you want to spend your last years? Trying to destroy the company you built?" His expression didn't change. "I built this company," he said finally. "You just took it." I didn't react. I saved it. From you." Silence. Then I leaned forward. "But let's be clear about something. If you keep trying to pull me down, I won't just expose your past mistakes." I let the words settle. "I'll erase your name from this company forever." A flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt. Uncertainty. He knew I wasn't bluffing. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, he gave a slow nod. And just like that, the war ended. For real this time. The war was finally over. No more hidden battles. No more fights for control. No more whispers behind my back. I had won. Completely. For years, I had been trapped in a fight to prove myself, to show my father that I was worthy, to prove to my brother that I wasn't someone he could push aside. But now I understood something. I had never needed their approval. I had never needed their recognition. I had only needed power, and I had taken it. The day after my final meeting with my father, I walked into my office as usual. But something felt different. For the first time in 15 years, there were no calls from my father, no passive-aggressive messages from my brother, no uncertainty hanging over me, just silence. But this silence wasn't like before. It wasn't the silence of people waiting for me to fail. It wasn't the silence of a family pushing me aside. It was respect, because now no one questioned who was in charge. Now, when employees looked at me, I didn't see hesitation in their eyes. I saw certainty. I was no longer the daughter of the former CEO. I was the CEO, the leader, the empire itself. A month later, I received a message from my father, a simple request: dinner. For a long time, I stared at the message. A year ago, I would have jumped at the opportunity. A few months ago, I would have ignored it. Now I wasn't sure if I even cared, but I agreed. We met at a quiet, upscale restaurant, a place he used to take me to when I was a child. When I arrived, he was already there, waiting. He looked older, tired, like a man who had finally realized he had lost everything. For the first few minutes, we didn't speak. Then, finally, he sighed. "So, you did it." I took a sip of my drink. I did. A small nod. "You built something powerful." I didn't react. I didn't need his praise. Not anymore. Then he looked at me carefully. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to say yes, to tell him that winning had been worth it, that proving him wrong had been everything I had ever wanted. But I hesitated. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I had spent so long fighting for this moment, so long proving myself, and now that I had won, what came next? I set my glass down. "Happiness doesn't matter," I said finally. "Power does." He let out a slow breath. "I underestimated you." I smiled. "Yes, you did." And for the first time, I saw it in his eyes. Not disappointment, not anger, respect, and that was enough. The next morning, I arrived at my office just like I always did. I sat behind my desk, looking out over the city skyline. This was my world now, my empire. I had no regrets. My father had tried to erase me. My brother had tried to replace me. But in the end, they were the ones who had lost everything. And me? I was exactly where I was meant to be, because power isn't given, it's taken. And I had taken it all.